My name is Cadence and I'm 32. The phone ringing at 11:47 p.m. should have been my first warning that this Friday night was about to become the kind of unforgettable that makes you question everything you thought you knew about justice. Mom, I'm at the police station. My stepmom hit me, but she's saying I attacked her. Dad doesn't believe me. Jacob's voice cracked through the phone like a whip across my heart. My 11-year-old son was calling me from a police station, accused of attacking a grown woman. The same woman who'd been making his life miserable for 4 years, but apparently I was the only one keeping score. I was already throwing on clothes before he finished explaining. Stay calm, baby. Don't say anything else until I get there. I'm coming right now. Andrew appeared in the doorway, hair messy from sleep but instantly alert. What's wrong? One look at my face and he was already reaching for his shirt. That's the thing about my husband. Crisis brings out something steady and determined in him that makes me feel like maybe, just maybe, everything's going to be okay. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt your heart shatter over a midnight phone call. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. The drive to the police station felt like navigating through thick fog, even though the night was clear. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white, while Andrew held my free hand and radiated that calm confidence that had drawn me to him in the first place. My mind was racing through worst-case scenarios, but I kept coming back to the same thought. How did we get here? Because what I found at that police station wasn't just my scared son sitting in a chair designed for adults, with red marks on his face and scratches on his arms that made my blood boil. It was my ex-husband Caleb standing next to his wife Tiffany, both of them painting my child as some kind of violent delinquent who couldn't control his temper. But here's the thing that made this whole nightmare particularly twisted. 4 years ago, I was a completely different woman. Broken, defeated, starting over from absolute zero with nothing but a 7-year-old kid and more debt than dignity. 4 years ago, if someone had told me I'd walk into that police station and watch grown men stumble over themselves to apologize for their mistakes, I would have laughed until I cried. But that's exactly what happened. And to understand why that moment felt sweeter than every piece of chocolate I stress ate during my divorce combined, you need to know about the marriage that nearly destroyed me, the woman who tried to erase my son from his father's life, and the incredible man who helped me rebuild everything from scratch. Because this story doesn't start with Jacob's terrified phone call from a police station. It starts with the day I discovered my husband was living a double life, and my perfectly planned future exploded like a house of cards in a hurricane. 4 years earlier, I genuinely believed I was living the American dream with a man who turned out to be more interested in the American scheme. Caleb and I lived in his parents' gorgeous colonial house, complete with the white picket fence and everything you see in those insurance commercials. I worked full-time as a dental hygienist while he managed his family's insurance business, and we had Jacob, who was 7 years old and absolutely perfect in every way that mattered. The only thing that occasionally nagged at me was our financial arrangement, which in hindsight was about as balanced as a seesaw with an elephant on one end. Every month, I dutifully deposited my entire paycheck minus basic living expenses into our joint savings account, watching that number grow with the satisfaction of someone building something meaningful. Meanwhile, Caleb's money seemed to evaporate into thin air, primarily flowing toward the monthly payments on his BMW that was apparently essential for his professional image. But I trusted him. God help me. I actually trusted him. The day my world imploded started like any other Wednesday. I was doing laundry, going through Caleb's pockets because the man treated clothing like personal storage units, when his phone tumbled out and lit up with a text notification. The sender was simply listed as T, and the message read, "Can't wait for our weekend getaway. I love you more than anything." I stood there in our laundry room, holding this piece of technology that contained the evidence of my husband's betrayal, feeling like someone had just informed me that gravity was optional. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through months of messages between Caleb and someone named Tiffany from his office. Months of secret plans, intimate photos I never wanted to see, and detailed discussions about their future together that decidedly did not include me or Jacob. The messages painted a picture of a man I'd never actually known, someone who described our marriage as a mistake I'm finally ready to fix, and referred to Jacob as the complication that ties me to my past. Reading those words felt like swallowing glass mixed with acid. When I confronted him that evening, I was prepared for denial, tears, maybe even some begging for forgiveness. What I got instead was cold indifference that cut deeper than any screaming match could have. He looked at me with the expression someone might wear while discussing the weather and said, "I've been unhappy for years, Cadence. You had to know this was coming." The divorce proceedings that followed were a masterclass in how the legal system can fail someone who played by all the rules. Since Caleb had gotten smart after my discovery and deleted everything, I couldn't prove the affair that everyone knew had happened. Without proof of infidelity, I was entitled to exactly half of our joint savings account, the account that I had been filling for 8 years while he played with his luxury car payments. The house we'd called home belonged to his parents, so I got the privilege of packing up my life and my son's life into boxes while my soon-to-be ex-husband continued living in domestic bliss. The BMW he drove to work every day was conveniently registered to his mother, making it completely untouchable in divorce proceedings. His lifestyle remained exactly the same, minus the wife who'd been bankrolling his comfortable existence. Meanwhile, I found myself apartment hunting in the cheapest neighborhoods I could find, eventually settling on a 2-bedroom unit with walls so thin I could hear our neighbor's television through 3 rooms. Jacob cried himself to sleep for the first 3 nights, asking me over and over why Daddy didn't love us anymore. I worked double shifts to make rent, picking up every available hour at the dental office while Caleb continued his charmed existence in the house I'd helped maintain, driving the car I'd helped him afford. The child support he was ordered to pay barely covered Jacob's school supplies, let alone the reality of raising a child. And through it all, I kept thinking this had to be rock bottom, that surely things couldn't possibly get any worse. I was spectacularly wrong. 3 months after our divorce was finalized, Caleb married Tiffany in what can only be described as the kind of wedding I'd always dreamed of having. Not some quick courthouse ceremony, but a full production with flowers, a reception, and enough guests to fill a small church. Jacob came home from his first weekend at Daddy and Tiffany's house, carrying a party favor bag and stories about how beautiful everything had been. What he didn't tell me immediately, because he was 7 and still believed the best in people, was how his new stepmother had looked at him during the reception, like he was a wine stain on her perfect white dress. How she'd whispered to her friends within his hearing that she didn't realize there'd be a child there at her own stepson's father's wedding. Tiffany worked in marketing at Caleb's company, which explained how they'd met and why she possessed the kind of manipulative skills that would make a politician jealous. She was 26 years old, blonde in that expensive salon way, and had never been married before. From her perspective, Jacob wasn't Caleb's beloved son who came as part of the package. He was living, breathing evidence that her husband had an entire life before her, a life that included me. To be fair to Tiffany, and I'm feeling generous today, she did try to play the devoted stepmother role initially. She bought Jacob expensive toys that he didn't particularly want, took carefully staged selfies with him for her social media accounts, and made elaborate displays of blending their family that looked perfect from the outside. But Jacob was smart enough to sense that her smiles never quite reached her eyes, and that her affection had the same authenticity as a $3 bill. The real Tiffany emerged gradually, like a slow-acting poison that takes time to reveal its true effects. It started with small corrections that felt reasonable on the surface. Jacob, honey, we use proper manners in this house. Jacob, indoor voice, please. You're not at a playground. Jacob, you're tracking mud through my clean kitchen. Every single thing he did was somehow wrong. The way he held his fork wasn't sophisticated enough. His natural speaking voice was too loud for her delicate sensibilities, and his mere existence in spaces she considered hers was treated like a personal assault on her peace of mind. When he came home from visits, he'd be quiet and withdrawn, a stark contrast to the chatty, energetic boy I knew. When I asked about his weekends, he'd just shrug and say they were fine, which anyone with half a brain knows is kid speak for absolutely terrible, but I don't want to cause more problems. I was working 60-hour weeks trying to rebuild our life from scratch, which meant Jacob spent most afternoons in after-school care while I worked overtime to afford our basic necessities. The guilt of not being there when he got home was eating me alive, and the last thing I wanted was to create more drama by complaining about his stepmother's attitude. Besides, family court judges don't typically appreciate bitter ex-wives who can't let go gracefully. Meanwhile, Caleb seemed happier than I'd ever seen him. For the first time since I'd known him, he was actually present in his relationship, probably because Tiffany commanded his attention in ways I never could. He bought her jewelry that cost more than my monthly rent, took her on weekend trips to places we'd never been able to afford, and posted photos of them looking blissfully happy that made my dental hygienist's salary feel like pocket change. Jacob noticed everything. Dad doesn't take me places anymore, he mentioned one night over our usual dinner of frozen pizza, which was about all I could manage financially and energy-wise. He says Tiffany gets carsick when there are too many people in the car. The irony wasn't lost on me. that a woman who could handle marketing presentations to rooms full of executives suddenly developed motion sickness when confined in a vehicle with her stepson. But what was I supposed to do? Call Caleb and demand he explain why his new wife was more important than his child? I'd learned enough about divorce dynamics to know that path led nowhere good. So I bit my tongue and told Jacob that sometimes adults need time to adjust to big changes, while silently planning ways to make our tiny apartment feel more like the home he deserved. What I didn't realize was that Tiffany was just getting started. By the time Jacob turned 9, I could have written a handbook on the warning signs I was too exhausted and overwhelmed to recognize. Every visit to his father's house followed the same predictable script. Caleb would call on Thursday night, voice full of enthusiasm, promising something special for the weekend. A trip to the amusement park, a movie Jacob wanted to see, maybe even a sleepover with friends. Jacob would spend Friday at school practically vibrating with excitement, already planning what he'd wear for their adventure, or what snacks he'd pack for the movie. I'd watch his face light up as he described his father's promises, and my heart would break a little more each time, because I was starting to see a pattern that my 9-year-old son couldn't recognize yet. Sunday evening would arrive with the predictability of taxes, and Jacob would walk through our door looking like someone had slowly deflated him with a pin. His shoulders would be slumped, his eyes would be red-rimmed, and his usual chatter about his weekend would be replaced with monosyllabic responses that told me everything I needed to know. "What happened to the amusement park, baby?" I'd ask as gently as possible, trying to keep the anger out of my voice. "Tiffany had a headache," he'd mumble, not making eye contact. Or, "Tiffany wanted to go shopping for new curtains instead." Or my personal favorite, "Tiffany said I was being too loud, so Dad made me stay in my room while they went to dinner." The worst part wasn't even Tiffany's creative excuses for ruining my son's weekends. It was watching Jacob internalize her criticism and start to believe there was something wrong with him. He began asking me questions that no child should have to ask. "Mom, do you think I'm annoying? And why doesn't Tiffany like me? And am I the reason Dad seems sad when I'm there?" One Sunday, he came home with a bruise on his shin that looked fresh and painful. When I asked about it, he said he'd tripped, but something in his eyes made every maternal instinct I possessed start screaming. "Jacob, you know you can tell me anything, right? If something happened, if someone hurt you or made you feel bad." "No one hurt me," he said quickly. Too quickly. With the kind of defensiveness that children only use when they're protecting adults who don't deserve protection. I just fell when Tiffany told me to get out of the kitchen. I was in her way while she was cooking. That night, I called Caleb and tried to have a rational adult conversation about our son's obvious distress. "We need to talk about Jacob," I said, skipping the pleasantries because I'd run out of patience for pretending everything was normal. "What about him?" Caleb's tone was already defensive, like he knew exactly what conversation was coming and had prepared his arguments in advance. "He's coming home upset every weekend. He's walking on eggshells in your house, and it's affecting his behavior here too. Something needs to change." The silence stretched for several seconds before Caleb responded with the kind of calculated cruelty that reminded me why our marriage had failed so spectacularly. "Maybe if you taught him some basic manners and respect, he'd fit in better with our family. Tiffany's not used to children, Cadence. She's trying her best, but Jacob can be challenging. She shouldn't have to get used to your son, Caleb. He's not some inconvenient side effect of your previous life. He's your child, and he should feel welcome in your home." "Don't tell me how to handle my family," he snapped. And the possessive emphasis on "my" told me everything I needed to know about where Jacob ranked in his list of priorities. His family. The words hit me like a physical blow because I understood exactly what he meant. His real family was Tiffany now, with her perfectly coordinated home decor and her aversion to the chaos that comes with children. Jacob and I were just obligations from his past, inconvenient reminders of the life he'd outgrown. That same week, in what felt like a sign from the universe that maybe things could get better, I ran into Monica at the grocery store. Monica had been my college roommate and remained one of those friends who could read my face like a book written in large print. We ended up grabbing coffee, and I found myself unloading about the divorce, the cramped apartment, the constant struggle to make ends meet while watching Caleb live like a bachelor with unlimited resources and no responsibility. "You know," Monica said thoughtfully, stirring her latte with the kind of deliberate motion that meant she was about to say something significant. "You should call Andrew." Andrew. I hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in years, but my heart did this little skip anyway, like muscle memory kicking in after a long dormancy. "I heard through the grapevine that he moved back to town," Monica continued, watching my face carefully. "He's working downtown now, doing really well for himself. Never married, as far as I know." That night, lying in my secondhand bed while Jacob slept in his small room that I'd tried to make cheerful with discount store decorations, I stared at the ceiling and let myself think about Andrew Reeves for the first time in years. We'd been so good together in college. Smart, funny, ambitious, and absolutely crazy about each other. We'd talked seriously about marriage and kids and building something real together. But then life had pulled us in different directions after graduation, the way life does when you're young and think love can survive anything. He'd gotten that amazing job offer in Chicago, and I'd been offered a position here. We were both too proud and too scared to ask the other to sacrifice their career, so we'd made the kind of mutual decision that feels mature at 22 and stupid at 32. I never imagined that someday, when we're ready would arrive when I was a broke single mother sleeping on a mattress I'd bought with a payment plan, but maybe Monica was right. Maybe it was time to be brave enough to find out what someday might look like. Finding Andrew on social media required the kind of careful stalking that would make a private investigator proud, and I spent an embarrassing amount of time scrolling through his photos before I worked up the courage to send a message. He was even more handsome than he'd been in college, with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from building a successful career and knowing exactly who you are in the world. His response came within an hour, which either meant he was pathetically glued to his phone or genuinely excited to hear from me. "Cadence, I can't believe it's really you. I heard through mutual friends that you were back in town. Any chance you'd like to grab coffee this weekend and catch up properly?" We met at a small downtown cafe that served the kind of overpriced coffee that I usually couldn't justify buying. And the moment I saw him waiting at a corner table, it felt like stepping into a warm house after being out in the cold for years. Same easy smile that had made my stomach flutter in college. Same way of listening, like every word I said was the most interesting thing he'd heard all day. When I told him about the divorce, he didn't offer empty platitudes or try to fix everything with optimistic speeches about better days ahead. He just listened with the kind of focused attention that made me remember what it felt like to be truly heard by another person. "You're stronger than you think," he said finally, leaning back in his chair and studying my face with those intelligent eyes I'd never forgotten. "You always were, even in college. I used to watch you tackle those impossible organic chemistry problems with this determination that made me think you could probably run the world if you set your mind to it." That first coffee turned into dinner the following weekend. Dinner led to long phone conversations after Jacob went to bed. The kind of talks that stretch past midnight because you're rediscovering someone who used to know all your secrets. Phone calls evolved into weekend dates when Jacob was at his father's house. And for the first time in years, I felt like Cadence again. Not just Jacob's mom or Caleb's ex-wife, but the woman I'd been before life taught me to expect disappointment. Andrew was incredibly patient with Jacob, never trying to replace his father, but gradually creating his own space in our son's life. They bonded over baseball, something Caleb had never shown much interest in, claiming sports were too time-consuming for a busy professional. Andrew taught Jacob to throw a proper curveball in our apartment complex's small courtyard, and I'd watch from the kitchen window as my son laughed in ways I'd almost forgotten were possible. "I love that kid," Andrew told me one night after Jacob had fallen asleep on the couch between us during a movie marathon featuring every superhero film ever made. "He loves you too," I whispered back, and realized as I said it that I loved Andrew. Had never really stopped loving him, if I was being completely honest with myself. When Andrew proposed 8 months later, it was perfect in its simplicity. No grand gestures or public displays that would have felt forced and artificial. Just him and me and Jacob making dinner in our small kitchen on a Tuesday night. He got down on one knee right there between the refrigerator and the stove, while Jacob cheered and asked if this meant Andrew would live with us forever. "Is that okay with you?" Andrew asked Jacob seriously, because he understood that marrying me meant becoming a stepfather, and he'd never treated that responsibility lightly. "Are you kidding?" Jacob said, grinning so wide I thought his face might crack. "Can I be your best man?" Our wedding was small and beautiful, held in the garden of a local bed and breakfast, with just our closest family and friends in attendance. Jacob was our ring bearer, wearing a suit that Andrew had helped him pick out, and sporting a smile that made every difficult moment of the past few years feel worth it. For the first time since my divorce, I felt like we were a real family again. The absolute best part was watching Andrew with Jacob in those early weeks of living together. He never overstepped or tried to parent him, but he showed up in all the ways that actually mattered. Homework help when Jacob was struggling with math, bedtime stories read in silly voices that made giggling echo through our small apartment, early morning baseball practice on weekends when most people were still asleep. Jacob finally had a man in his life who put him first, who asked about his day and actually listened to the answers. Who remembered which vegetables he hated and which ice cream flavors were his favorites? It was everything I'd dreamed of when I imagined what a healthy family could look like. But even as our happiness grew stronger every day, the situation with Caleb and Tiffany seemed to be getting progressively worse, like a storm building on the horizon that we couldn't quite ignore anymore. Have you ever experienced a moment when you realized someone in your life was actively trying to hurt your child? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because what happened next will make you understand exactly how far a mother will go to protect her baby. Living with Andrew transformed our daily existence in ways I hadn't expected, but it seemed to make Tiffany even more resentful of Jacob's very existence. She started calling with increasingly frequent last-minute changes to custody schedules, claiming sudden family emergencies or unexpected work obligations that somehow always coincided with activities Jacob was looking forward to. "Sorry, but Tiffany's grandmother is in the hospital this weekend," Caleb would announce on Friday afternoons, despite the fact that both of Tiffany's grandparents had died before she was born, a detail I remembered from Jacob's stories about family gatherings. When Jacob did manage to have his scheduled visits, he came home with stories that made me want to drive to Caleb's house and have a very frank conversation about appropriate step-parenting techniques. Tiffany had accidentally served him food containing nuts, despite knowing about his mild allergy. She'd thrown away his homework because it was cluttering her pristine counter space. She'd instituted a rule that he wasn't allowed to call me during visits because it made his father uncomfortable and disrupted their family time. "She told me that you probably don't want to talk to me anyway since you have a new family now," Jacob confided one evening, his voice so small it made my chest ache. I knelt down to his eye level and took his hands in mine. "Baby, listen to me very carefully. You are my family. Andrew is part of our family because I love him and he loves us. But you will always, always be my first priority. You're my son, and nothing in this world will ever change that." Jacob nodded, but I could see the damage Tiffany's psychological warfare was inflicting. She was systematically trying to convince him that he didn't belong anywhere, not in his father's house with their real family, and not in mine with my new husband. The cruelty of it was breathtaking in its calculated precision. The breaking point came on a humid Friday evening in July that felt heavy with the kind of atmospheric pressure that usually precedes serious storms. Jacob was supposed to spend the weekend with Caleb, and he'd been looking forward to it because his father had promised they'd go to a baseball game, one of the few activities they'd shared since Andrew had rekindled Jacob's love of the sport. When Caleb arrived to pick him up, his mood was already darker than usual, and he barely acknowledged Andrew's polite greeting from our front porch. "Jacob needs to be on his absolute best behavior this weekend," Caleb announced without preamble, like he was delivering a warning rather than greeting his son. "Tiffany hasn't been feeling well lately, and she needs peace and quiet." I watched my son's shoulders slump as they drove away, and Andrew wrapped his arms around me from behind as we stood watching until their car disappeared around the corner. "He's going to be okay," Andrew murmured into my hair. But even his usually reassuring voice carried a note of concern that made my stomach clench with worry. I had this feeling deep in my gut, the same maternal instinct that had warned me about Caleb's affair months before I found the evidence. Something was building toward an explosion, and Jacob was caught directly in the blast radius. Tiffany was getting bolder with each passing month, Caleb was becoming more distant and defensive, and my son was bearing the emotional cost of their dysfunction. The weekend felt different from the moment Jacob left with his father. Saturday passed without the usual check-in call that Jacob liked to make, which wasn't unusual but still made me restless. Sunday came and went with complete radio silence, which was more concerning but still within the realm of normal weekend variations. When Andrew and I went to bed Sunday night, I felt like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. "Maybe I should call and check on him," I said, staring at the ceiling while Andrew read beside me. "Let's give them space tonight," Andrew advised, closing his book and turning off his bedside lamp. If something was seriously wrong, they'd call. Sometimes these weekends just run long. Famous last words if I've ever heard them. At exactly 11:47 p.m., my phone shattered the quiet of our bedroom with its shrill ringtone. The number on the screen made my blood turn to ice water. It was coming from the police station. 23 minutes later, Andrew and I were pulling into the police station parking lot, and the scene that greeted us was like something out of a bad television drama. Caleb was pacing near the entrance like a caged animal, his face red with what appeared to be equal parts anger and humiliation. And there was Tiffany, leaning against the building with her arms crossed and wearing an expression of smug satisfaction that made me want to introduce her face to my fist. The moment she spotted me stepping out of Andrew's car, her demeanor shifted into something I can only describe as predatory anticipation, like a hunter who'd been waiting patiently for her prey to walk into the perfect trap. Well, she called out loud enough for everyone in the immediate vicinity to hear, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Look who finally decided to show up and deal with her violent child. Every muscle in my body tensed, and I felt Andrew's hand find mine in a gesture that was probably meant to be calming, but felt more like an anchor keeping me from launching myself at this woman who'd been tormenting my son for months. I kept walking straight toward the station doors, biting back my first 3 responses because they all involved vocabulary that would have made a sailor blush and wouldn't help Jacob's situation. But inside my head, I was composing a very detailed speech about Tiffany's questionable life choices and her obvious need for intensive therapy. That's when Caleb spotted Andrew, and I watched my ex-husband's face cycle through approximately 17 different emotions in the span of 3 seconds. First confusion, then recognition, followed by something that looked suspiciously like jealousy, mixed with pure, undiluted rage. "You brought him?" Caleb's voice carried across the parking lot with enough volume to wake people in neighboring counties. "You brought your new husband to deal with this family crisis?" "I brought my family to help our son," I replied evenly, not breaking stride toward the entrance. Because that's what Andrew was now. Family in every way that mattered. Unlike certain biological fathers who seemed more concerned about their wounded pride than their child's well-being. Andrew squeezed my hand gently, and I could feel the tension in his grip. He'd heard plenty of stories about Caleb over the past 2 years, none of them particularly flattering, but this was his first real encounter with my ex-husband's charming personality. Inside the police station, the fluorescent lighting made everything look harsh and institutional, like a place designed to strip away any illusions about human nature. Jacob sat in a plastic chair that made him look even smaller than his 11 years, his face streaked with tears and marked with angry red welts that made my stomach clench with protective rage. An officer with tired eyes and a name tag reading Martinez looked up from his paperwork when we entered. He had the expression of someone working a late shift and dealing with more family drama than any reasonable person should have to handle. "Mrs. Patterson?" he asked, consulting his notes with the kind of weary efficiency that suggested this was just another domestic disturbance call in a long series of domestic disturbance calls. "Actually, it's Mrs. Reeves now," I corrected, because something told me that distinction was going to matter more than Officer Martinez currently realized. "This is my husband, Andrew." Andrew stepped forward with the kind of quiet confidence he brought to every situation, extending his hand in a gesture that was polite but somehow commanding at the same time. "Andrew Reeves. I'm Jacob's stepfather." Officer Martinez's entire demeanor shifted like someone had just told him he was on camera. Not dramatically, but enough that I noticed his shoulders straighten and his attention become more focused. Something about Andrew's presence was changing the entire dynamic of this situation, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was yet. "Mr. Reeves," Martinez said with a respectful nod that seemed to carry more weight than simple politeness. "I wasn't aware you were involved in this situation." Behind us, I heard Tiffany's sharp intake of breath, and when I glanced over my shoulder, her expression had shifted from smug satisfaction to something that looked suspiciously like concern. Apparently, she hadn't expected Andrew's arrival to change anything significant about the evening's proceedings. She was about to learn exactly how wrong she could be. "I wasn't aware either," Andrew said with the kind of calm precision that made everyone in the room pay closer attention, "until my stepson called us from your station at nearly midnight, saying he'd been physically assaulted and was being treated like a criminal." The words hung in the air like smoke from a recently fired gun, and I watched Caleb's face turn an interesting shade of purple that probably wasn't medically advisable. He stepped forward with the kind of aggressive posture that suggested he was about to say something spectacularly stupid. "Now wait just a minute," Caleb sputtered, his voice rising with each word. "Your stepson attacked my wife. He's been acting out for months, getting violent and disrespectful. And tonight he finally crossed a line that can't be uncrossed." Andrew didn't raise his voice or change his expression, but something in his tone made the entire room go quiet. "Caleb, I think you should let the officers handle their investigation before you make any more statements." The power shift in that room was immediate and unmistakable. Suddenly, Officer Martinez was looking at Jacob with different eyes, taking in the red marks on his face and the scratches on his arms with what appeared to be growing concern rather than skepticism. "Son," Martinez said, crouching down to Jacob's level with the kind of gentleness that should have been present from the beginning. "Can you tell me exactly what happened tonight? Take your time and start from the beginning." Jacob glanced nervously at his father, then at Tiffany, then finally at me. I gave him the most encouraging smile I could manage under the circumstances and nodded for him to continue. "She started it," he said, his voice small but gaining strength as he spoke. Tiffany was angry because I accidentally spilled some juice on her kitchen counter when I was trying to make a snack. She called me clumsy and stupid and said I was ruining her peaceful weekend. Then what happened? Martinez prompted gently, his pen poised over his notepad. When I tried to clean it up, she said I was making it worse and that I never do anything right. Then she told me I was just like my mom, useless and messy and disappointing. Jacob's voice caught slightly on the words, and I felt Andrew's hand tighten around mine in solidarity. Caleb opened his mouth to interrupt, but one look from Andrew seemed to shut him down before he could voice whatever defense he'd been planning. Then she said something really mean. Jacob continued, his young voice carrying a weight that no child should have to bear. She said maybe if I wasn't around anymore, Dad would finally be happy. She said I ruined everything good in their life, just by existing. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as Martinez continued writing, his expression growing more serious with each detail Jacob provided. I told her that wasn't true and that my mom was the best mom in the world. That's when she got really, really angry. Jacob touched the scratches on his arm gingerly. She grabbed me by the arm and shook me hard. See these marks? That's from this morning, too, when she pulled me out of the car because I wasn't moving fast enough. I watched Officer Martinez's eyebrows rise as he made note of this additional information, and Andrew leaned forward slightly with renewed interest. She's been hurting you on other occasions? Andrew asked carefully, and I could hear something in his voice that suggested this detail was more significant than it might seem. Jacob nodded and pushed up his sleeves to reveal additional bruises in various stages of healing. She grabs me a lot when Dad's not looking, but today she was angry about something else, and when I talked back to her, she slapped me across the face and pushed me hard enough that I fell against the kitchen table. Martinez was taking detailed notes now, and his entire approach to the situation had transformed from routine domestic call to serious investigation. "And where was your father during this incident?" Martinez asked. "He came in right after I started crying, but Tiffany told him that I had attacked her first, that I hit her and called her horrible names. Dad didn't even ask me what really happened. He just started yelling at me and called you guys." I looked at Caleb, this man I'd once planned to spend my life with, who had just chosen his wife's fabricated version of events over his own son's obvious injuries and tears. The disappointment was so deep, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. "That's quite a serious accusation," Martinez said, standing up and looking directly at Tiffany. "Ma'am, you're claiming this 11-year-old child attacked you unprovoked?" Tiffany lifted her chin defiantly, but I noticed her hands were trembling slightly. "He's been increasingly aggressive and disrespectful. Tonight he completely lost control and became violent when I tried to discipline him appropriately." "I see," Martinez said, consulting his notes again. "And you sustained injuries from this alleged attack?" Tiffany hesitated for just a moment too long, and in that pause, her entire story started to unravel like a poorly made sweater. "Emotional trauma," she said finally. "He was screaming at me, threatening me, completely out of control." Andrew stepped forward with the kind of measured confidence I was starting to recognize as his professional demeanor kicking into high gear. "Officer Martinez," he said in a tone that somehow commanded attention without being loud, "I'd like to respectfully request that you examine any available security footage from the apartment complex. Most residential buildings these days have cameras covering the entrances and common areas." The color drained from Tiffany's face so quickly I thought she might faint, and I realized that Andrew had just suggested the one thing she'd been desperately hoping no one would think to check. This was about to get very interesting. The next hour was like watching someone's carefully constructed house of lies collapse in real time, and I had to admit I was enjoying the show more than was probably healthy for my character development. Officer Martinez made some calls, and within 30 minutes, we found ourselves crowded into a small interview room with grainy security footage pulled up on a computer screen. Tiffany sat rigid in her chair, arms crossed defensively, while Caleb kept running his hands through his hair like he was trying to wake up from a nightmare that kept getting worse. Jacob sat safely between Andrew and me, finally starting to look less like a frightened animal and more like the confident kid I knew him to be. The first piece of footage showed their arrival that afternoon, and even I wasn't prepared for what we witnessed. The camera clearly captured Tiffany dragging Jacob out of the passenger side of the car by his arm, the motion so unnecessarily aggressive that Jacob stumbled and nearly fell onto the pavement. Caleb was visible in the frame, walking several steps ahead while talking on his phone, apparently oblivious to what was happening behind him. "That looks pretty rough for a simple car exit," Martinez commented mildly, making notes on his pad. "He was being deliberately slow," Tiffany said quickly, but her voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. We were running late for dinner plans. The next clip showed them returning from what appeared to be a grocery run. Again, Tiffany had Jacob by the arm, pulling him toward the building entrance while Caleb carried shopping bags and continued his phone conversation like his son's obvious distress was completely invisible. But it was the third piece of footage that sealed her fate with all the finality of a coffin nail. The timestamp showed 10:23 p.m., just over an hour before Jacob had called me in tears. The camera angle captured them on the apartment's covered balcony. And while we couldn't hear the audio, the body language told a story that was crystal clear to everyone watching. Jacob was backing away from Tiffany with his hands raised in a defensive posture, while she advanced on him with one finger pointed at his chest, her mouth moving rapidly in what was clearly a verbal assault. Then we watched her grab his arm roughly and shake him before pushing him hard enough that he stumbled backward against the sliding glass door. The slap came next, and it was captured with devastating clarity. Tiffany's hand connecting sharply with my son's face, followed immediately by Jacob's hands flying up to cover his cheek as he started to cry. The room fell into complete heavy silence that stretched for several long moments. "Well," Martinez said finally, his voice carrying a tone of grim satisfaction, "that certainly provides some clarity to the evening's events." Andrew leaned back in his chair with the expression I imagined he wore in courtrooms when opposing counsel walked directly into a trap they'd set for themselves. It was the look of someone who'd been absolutely right about what they'd find, but took no particular pleasure in human stupidity. "Officer Martinez," Andrew said with careful precision, "I believe you now have a very clear picture of what actually occurred in that apartment tonight." Caleb was staring at the frozen screen with what appeared to be genuine shock, like he was seeing his wife's true nature for the first time. "Tiffany, what the hell?" "It was discipline," she interrupted desperately, her composed facade finally cracking under the weight of undeniable evidence. "He was being completely disrespectful and defiant. Sometimes children need firm guidance to understand boundaries." "Ma'am," Martinez said, standing up with the kind of authority that made everyone else in the room take notice. "What we just witnessed on that security footage isn't discipline. That's assault on a minor, and it's a serious criminal offense." The beautiful irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. 4 hours ago, Jacob had been sitting in this same police station being treated like a dangerous criminal. Now Tiffany was about to be arrested while Jacob sat safely between his real parents, because that's what Andrew had become, in all the ways that truly mattered. Looking at Caleb's stunned expression, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But not quite enough to forget that he'd spent months choosing to believe this woman's lies over his own son's obvious distress. What happened next unfolded with the kind of poetic justice that makes you believe the universe occasionally gets its act together. Officer Martinez read Tiffany her rights while she protested that this was all a terrible misunderstanding, that Jacob was a troubled child who needed strict discipline, and that everyone was overreacting to normal step-parent challenges. "This is completely insane," Caleb kept repeating, his voice cracking like an adolescent going through puberty. "There has to be some rational explanation for all this." "There is an explanation," I said quietly, surprised by how calm my own voice sounded considering the rage burning through my veins. "Your wife has been systematically abusing your son for months, and you chose not to see it because acknowledging it would have complicated your perfect new life." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and I watched Caleb's face cycle through denial, anger, and what might have been the first glimpse of genuine remorse he'd shown all evening. The ride home was subdued but peaceful, in a way our car hadn't felt in months. Jacob sat in the back seat of Andrew's sedan, still processing everything that had happened, but looking more relaxed than I'd seen him after a visit to his father's house in years. When we reached our modest apartment, Andrew made hot chocolate with extra marshmallows while I helped Jacob wash his face and apply antiseptic to his scratches. "Mom?" Jacob said as I was tucking him into bed, his voice small but clearer than it had been in the police station. "Do I have to go back there? To Dad and Tiffany's house?" "No, baby," I assured him, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "Not until a judge decides it's completely safe, and maybe not even then." "Good," he whispered, and the relief in his voice broke my heart all over again. "I never want to see her again, and I don't think I want to see Dad for a while either." Over the following weeks, the legal proceedings moved with surprising efficiency. The security footage, combined with Jacob's detailed testimony and a medical examination that documented both fresh injuries and older bruises in various stages of healing, painted an undeniable picture of ongoing abuse that even the most skeptical family court judge couldn't ignore. Tiffany was charged with child endangerment and assault, though her expensive lawyer managed to negotiate the charges down to misdemeanors with a plea agreement. She received 2 years of supervised probation, a substantial fine that probably hurt more than jail time would have, mandatory anger management counseling, and court-ordered therapy to address whatever psychological issues made her think abusing a child was acceptable behavior. Most importantly, she was permanently prohibited from having any contact with Jacob, which meant that if Caleb wanted to maintain a relationship with his son, he'd have to choose between his wife and his child. The family court judge was particularly unimpressed with Caleb's complete failure to protect his son from obvious abuse happening in his own home. "Your Honor," Caleb's lawyer argued weakly, "my client had no knowledge of his wife's inappropriate behavior toward the child." Judge Richardson looked at Caleb over his reading glasses with the kind of expression usually reserved for people who insisted the earth was flat. "Mr. Patterson, you live in the same house as this child. According to the security footage, you were present during some of these incidents. Are you seriously asking this court to believe you were completely unaware that your wife was physically and emotionally abusing your son?" Caleb sat in uncomfortable silence, because what possible answer could he give? That he was so wrapped up in his new marriage that he'd forgotten his primary responsibility as a father? That he'd chosen to believe his wife's lies rather than investigate his son's obvious distress? That he'd been willfully blind because acknowledging the truth would have required him to make difficult choices? The court suspended Caleb's unsupervised visitation rights indefinitely. Any future contact with Jacob would be limited to supervised visits in a public setting, with the possibility of gradually restored privileges only if Jacob expressed interest and a court-appointed therapist deemed it appropriate for his emotional well-being. 6 months later, Tiffany completed her plea agreement and received the minimum sentence allowed under law. Their marriage lasted exactly 2 more weeks after her conviction became final. Turns out that when you remove the shared enemy of an 11-year-old boy from the equation, some couples discover they don't actually have much in common after all. The first court-mandated supervised visit between Caleb and Jacob took place at a family resource center downtown, in a cheerfully decorated room filled with toys and games designed to help fractured families attempt some kind of healing. I dropped Jacob off with strict instructions to call me immediately if he felt uncomfortable, and Andrew waited in the parking lot reading case files just in case we needed to make a quick exit. Jacob emerged after exactly 60 minutes looking emotionally drained and somehow older than his 12 years. "How did it go, buddy?" I asked gently as we drove home through the familiar streets of our neighborhood. "Dad kept apologizing over and over," Jacob said quietly, staring out the passenger window at the passing houses. "He said he didn't know what Tiffany was really doing, and he wanted us to be a family again like before. How do you feel about that?" Jacob was silent for a long moment, and I could see him working through thoughts that were too complex for someone his age to have to navigate. "I don't believe him, Mom," he said finally, his voice carrying a sadness that made my chest ache. "He was there when she said mean things to me. He heard her call me names and tell me I was ruining their life. He just didn't care enough to stop her." The devastating clarity of childhood struck again. Jacob had identified the fundamental truth that all of Caleb's apologies and explanations couldn't change. When it mattered most, his father had chosen Tiffany's comfort over his son's safety. The supervised visits continued for 3 months, each one leaving Jacob quieter and less enthusiastic about the next one. Caleb spent most of their time together trying to explain and justify his past behavior, rather than simply acknowledging the harm he'd allowed to happen. "Do I have to keep going?" Jacob asked me one evening after a particularly difficult session where Caleb had brought photo albums from Jacob's early childhood, apparently thinking that nostalgia would somehow erase years of neglect and poor choices. Andrew and I discussed it that night after Jacob went to bed. "Legally, the court order requires these visits until Jacob is old enough to petition for changes himself," Andrew explained. "But we could speak with the family therapist about Jacob's feelings and see if she'd recommend modifications to the arrangement." The court-appointed therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen, was a practical woman with extensive experience in family trauma. After several sessions with Jacob, she agreed that the supervised visits were becoming counterproductive and potentially re-traumatizing. "The child is being forced to repeatedly engage with a parent who cannot acknowledge the extent of his failures," she wrote in her official report to the court. Rather than facilitating healing, these visits are reinforcing Jacob's sense that his emotional needs are secondary to adult expectations. She recommended that visits be reduced to once monthly, with the option for Jacob to refuse them entirely when he turned 14 and could legally express his preferences to the court. Jacob chose to exercise that option immediately. Caleb called me when he received the notification, his voice a mixture of fury and desperation that reminded me why our marriage had been doomed long before Tiffany entered the picture. "You're poisoning him against me," he accused, falling back on the same blame-shifting tactics he'd always used when confronted with the consequences of his choices. "No, Caleb," I replied calmly. "You did that yourself when you allowed your wife to abuse him for months while you looked the other way because acknowledging it would have been inconvenient. I never meant for any of this to happen. But it did happen, and Jacob remembers every moment of it. He remembers feeling unsafe in your house, and he remembers you choosing to believe her lies over his tears." The phone went quiet for several long moments before Caleb spoke again, his voice defeated in a way I'd never heard before. "How do I fix this, Cadence? How do I get my son back?" I considered my words carefully because, despite everything, I didn't want to be cruel just for the sake of cruelty. "I honestly don't know if you can," I said finally. "But if you want any chance of a relationship with Jacob in the future, you need to stop making excuses and start taking full responsibility for the choices you made. And you need to understand that forgiveness isn't something you can demand or manipulate your way into earning." Caleb never called back, and frankly, I wasn't surprised. Taking real responsibility would have required him to acknowledge that he'd failed at the most important job he'd ever had, and that kind of honest self-reflection had never been his strong suit. But Jacob was thriving without the burden of forced reconciliation weighing him down, and that was what mattered most. 3 years have passed since that midnight phone call changed the trajectory of our entire family, and Jacob is now 14 years old, confident and genuinely happy in ways I never thought possible during those dark months when Tiffany was systematically trying to destroy his sense of self-worth. He and Andrew have developed a relationship that amazes me every single day. They still play baseball together, but now Andrew coaches Jacob's high school junior varsity team, and I love watching them work together on strategy and technique. They tackle homework side by side at our kitchen table, discuss girls and friendships and all the complicated social dynamics that come with being a teenager, and share inside jokes that make them both laugh until their sides hurt. Last month, Jacob asked Andrew if it would be okay for him to call him Dad instead of using his first name. "What about your biological father?" I asked gently, because I never wanted Jacob to feel like he had to choose between honoring his past and embracing his present. Jacob shrugged with the kind of matter-of-fact wisdom that teenagers sometimes possess. "Caleb is my biological father, and I guess I'll always be grateful that he helped create me. But Andrew is my dad in every way that actually matters." The distinction was important to him, and it clearly meant the world to Andrew, who got genuinely emotional when Jacob started using the title without any prompting or fanfare. As for me, I'm currently 8 months pregnant with our daughter, and yes, we're having a girl. We found out the gender last month, and Jacob has already started planning all the ways he's going to spoil his little sister and protect her from the various dangers of childhood. Watching him transform into the role of protective big brother tells me everything I need to know about the kind of man he's growing up to become. Andrew suggested we build a larger house so the baby would have her own nursery, but Jacob immediately volunteered to share his room until she's old enough to want privacy and independence. "I want to make sure she's never scared at night," he said with the kind of protective instinct that made my heart swell with pride. "And I want her to know she always has someone looking out for her. That's my son, still thinking about protecting people and making them feel safe, even after everything he's been through." Caleb sends birthday and Christmas cards now, always with handwritten notes asking if Jacob wants to see him or if there's anything he needs. Jacob reads them carefully and places them in a wooden box in his closet. He's not ready to forgive, and he may never be, but he's not consumed by anger either. He's just moved on with his life in the way that resilient children do when they're given love and stability. I don't push him toward reconciliation because some wounds need time to heal, and some relationships simply can't survive the damage that's been inflicted on them. Jacob will make his own decisions about his father when he's ready, if he's ever ready. But Jacob is absolutely thriving in every way that matters. His grades are excellent. He has a solid group of friends who appreciate his loyalty and humor, and he knows without any doubt that he's loved and valued and protected by the people who matter most in his life. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I hadn't found Andrew again. If Jacob had been facing Tiffany's abuse without a stepfather who understood how to navigate the legal system and ensure that justice was actually served. The thought still makes me physically sick. But we did find each other, Andrew and I. And when Jacob needed protection, we had the knowledge and resources and determination to make sure he got it. Sometimes the universe does get its timing exactly right. Our daughter will be born into a house filled with laughter, unconditional love, and the kind of stability I once thought was impossible to achieve. She'll have a big brother who adores her already, parents who choose each other every single day, and the security of knowing that her family will always put her well-being first. And somewhere across town, my ex-husband lives alone in his parents' house, driving a car that's falling apart, working at a job that barely covers his basic expenses. He chose Tiffany over Jacob, chose comfortable lies over difficult truths, and chose his own convenience over his child's safety and emotional well-being. Now he gets to live with those choices for the rest of his life, just like Jacob gets to live with the consequences of having a father who failed him when it mattered most. As for us, we're building something beautiful and real and permanent, the kind of family that nobody can take away from us because it's built on actual love and respect instead of obligation and convenience. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe for more stories about families who refuse to give up on each other, even when the odds seemed impossible. Sometimes the best revenge really is just building a life so wonderful that your past can't touch it. And Jacob, he's never been happier, safer, or more loved, which means I've never been more proud to be his mother. That's what victory looks like when you're finally brave enough to fight for what matters most.